the world's top currency speculator. He gambled on the value of the pound and won a record $1 billion. That's £12 for every man, woman and child in Britain. He made his killing on Black Wednesday, when the government no apology.
I play the game by the rules, and I have absolutely no sense of doing anything immoral.
With your money, he's become an international Robin Hood, taking from the West, giving to the East, building universities, aiding refugees, supporting democracy. Tonight, exclusively on This Week, the extraordinary life and times of George Soros, the man who broke the pound. In New York, it's another day and another dollar. Out there in the capitalist jungle, one predator has to be king. George Soros is the most successful money manager in history. Who says so? Everyone else in the jungle.
I think it's clear that he's the premier speculator, investor in the world, and he's what everybody else wants to grow up to be.
George Soros made the financial killing of a lifetime, perhaps of all time, when he gambled everything on the fall of the pound.
Is Anthony there?
Black Wednesday proved him right. The British government won't discuss speculators, but doesn't object to them. The opposition does.
I think there's been a popular revulsion at the scale of the killings that have been made by speculators. It probably amounts to something in the order of £2 billion against the British government over a period of only days.
George Soros makes money out of money. He invests in stocks and shares and companies and currencies around the world. His investors are delighted. £65,000 left with him 20 years ago would now be worth 50 million. From the 33rd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, George Soros runs the Quantum Fund.
14,800 is Quantum, and 10,200 is Quasar.
His own private dealing room, the hub of the Soros empire. He now commands such huge financial resources that when it comes to a fight over the international value of the pound, not even governments can match him.
Well, it's a little bit amazing to me too, frankly, you know, because I've been doing this for 20-odd years, and I started doing it with 4 million, and we are now doing it with 7 billion.
George Soros is the product and now the benefactor of another world. He was born a Jew in Hungary in 1930. His father was a lawyer, his childhood comfortably middle class. Until the final year of the war, the family suffered no direct threat from the Nazis. Until then, Hungary retained its own government. But the Russians were moving westwards. The Germans occupied Hungary. Budapest had the largest Jewish population in Eastern Europe. Deportations to Auschwitz began. To survive, the Soros family split up. The teenage George Soros kept a step ahead of the Nazis, hiding on occasions in this cellar.
I was 14 years old, and I was living under false identity, which was, of course, a very risky position, because had I been caught, I would have been killed.
That experience taught him about risk and survival, a link that may have contributed to later success.
I think it has a lot to do with it. Actually, this business about survival, because I do take risks, probably to a greater extent than most investors, and yet I'm very concerned with the need to survive and not to take risks that could actually destroy me.
The communist regime in Hungary is now also part of history, but in 1947 it offered him few prospects, and George Soros fled. First to Britain, where he studied at the London School of Economics, and then to the United States, where he became a financier. And now he's coming all the way back. We've travelled with him to the east and found that he has a unique financial problem.
Most of my effort goes into spending, about, let us say, 80 to 90%. I'm in touch with my office every day, but I don't actually make any of the decisions. There's a team running the business.
But it only takes, 10-15% of your time currently, the making money?
That's right. I find it easier to make it than to spend it, actually.
If it's Wednesday, this must be Prague. After making his killing on the pound, George Soros travelled around Europe working out what to do with the profit. In Czechoslovakia, local TV wondered what sort of capitalist he was.
I don't really run a business. You see, I invest in businesses run by other people. So I'm really a critic. And in a way, you could say that I am the highest paid critic in the world.
Prague was the city of Franz Kafka, of the castle and the trial. But with the Velvet Revolution of 1989, the intimidation ended. George Soros had financed dissidents against communism from the early 80s. Now he wants to underwrite further democratic developments in Czechoslovakia. That's the objective of all his donations.
It is to help in the transformation from what I call a closed society to an open society. That is to say, lay the foundations of a democratic, market-oriented society in which the state does not have a dominant role.
Do you regard yourself as a Robin Hood figure?
No, not particularly, except that, of course, I make my money in the West and I spend it in the East, so there is an element of redistribution involved. I've got all the money I need, and therefore I intend to step up my philanthropic activities. I'm thinking of setting aside something like $250 million to be spent as fast as possible.
Mr. Soros began his extraordinary spending spree in Hungary in 1984, giving away £700,000. In 1987, he donated more than £2.5 million and launched projects in the old Soviet Union. Since then, he has opened Soros Foundation offices throughout the East. And expenditure has been increasing dramatically. This year, he's handing out more than 22 million. And next year alone, he'll be giving away about 66 million from his latest deal. This is the project perhaps closest to his heart. It's the Prague campus of the Central European University, founded and financed by George Soros. With students from 12 countries already in residence, the idea is to bring East into contact with East. Soros money is channeled into cultural and political activity as well as academic. But now there's so much new cash that he wants to take on projects like aid to Yugoslavia and saving Russian science. One man's contribution to rebuilding Eastern Europe exceeds even what some Western governments can manage. At the opening of the new academic year, local support for the university is clear. Among the guests, Václav Havel, the former dissident who became president. When Mr. Soros spoke, he talked about his vision of an open society. He also talked money.
Originally, I committed $5 million a year for 5 years. That was $25 million to the university. Our current level of spending is already well in excess of that figure.
It was the students themselves, of course, who were the most appreciative, like this young man from the Ukraine.
It seems to me that he is a wise man, because he understands that the future of all the world depends on how this former communist region will develop.
I'm from Albania, and we just now are allowed to go abroad, and especially for studying. So it's very nice to stay here, and we have here the best tutors and the best teachers.
It's also the best that Western money can buy. And now it's going to be British taxpayers' cash, made by the man who broke the pound, that pays for it.
Right, 40 up, 20.
Black Wednesday. John Major's government had promised to defend the pound in the European exchange rate mechanism, the system designed to maintain the value of sterling alongside other European currencies. But they couldn't beat the speculators. The Chancellor of the Exchequer emerged from the Treasury to admit defeat.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism. The government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
180-40, give a cable.
Black Wednesday was a humiliating reverse for the government. It was, after all, John Major who had proudly taken Britain into the ERM in the first place. Currency dealers the world over gambled that the value of the pound couldn't be maintained. But it was in New York that the biggest bet was laid.
We had $7 billion of equity, and our total position was in the $10 billion range. So it was somewhat, let's say, 1.5 times our entire capital.
And this is what Mr. Soros did to make the fastest billion in history. Against the assets of his fund, he first of all borrowed £5 billion, that's 5,000 million. He then changed the pounds into Deutschmarks at an ERM rate of 2.79 to the pound. The hand he now held was in solid German Deutschmarks. Mr. Soros then waited for the British government to make its U-turn and for sterling to be devalued. By the end of September, the pound was down to only 2.5 Deutschmarks. This was the time to repay the original sterling loan. Since his Deutschmarks were now much more valuable, they weren't all needed to settle the debt. The remaining Deutschmarks were Mr. Soros's winnings. In dollars, that represents a profit of $1 billion.
What if, against the odds, the British government held the line?
Well, we would have lost some money. Nothing like the money we made, and of course this was a bet. It was what is called a one-way bet, because the loss would have been very small, and the profit was very large.
It represents something like £25, I calculate, for every British taxpayer, about £12 for every man, woman and child in Britain. Do you acknowledge that your profits mean a loss to Britain?
Yes. In this case, there's no question, because I know who the counterpart is. In any transaction, somebody wins and somebody loses. But in the normal course of events, you don't know who your counterpart is, and you don't know, whether he has a loss or profit. In this case, it's clear that the counterpart is the Bank of England. And I have absolutely no sense of guilt, I can assure you, because had I not taken the position, somebody else would have taken the position. And so it just happens that I played the game better or bigger than other people. But the unfortunate fact is that there is a loss to the British government out of this.
Even in the New York jungle, George Soros's killing on the pound stirred admiration and awe. But if anyone was going to bring off such a coup, it would be George Soros.
It didn't surprise me that that George and his organization were the ones that made the big killing on something like that, because it was an ideal type of opportunity for them and for an organization that's willing to take the big bets.
The government's commitment to our membership of the ERM was supposed to be as safe as the Bank of England, but it didn't work out that way. The losses here were huge as the bank used up foreign reserves in its efforts to defend the pound. The government won't say how much we lost, but it could run to several billion pounds. Put another way, it will have cost us more to defend sterling this autumn than it did to fight the Gulf War. Norman Lamont's current political troubles began in the run-up to Black Wednesday.
There are going to be no devaluations, no leaving the ERM. We are absolutely committed to the ERM. That is our policy. The government is determined to maintain our position.
And what went for the Chancellor in August went for the Prime Minister just a week before the crash. A government's credibility was being laid on the line.
The soft option, the devaluers option, the inflationary option, in my judgment, that would be a betrayal of our future at this moment. And I tell you categorically, that is not the government's policy.
But they hadn't allowed for the financial clout of men like George Soros. He was sure that the British were going to buckle, whatever the level of political reassurance coming from the other side of the Atlantic.
It did not carry that much conviction, because the realities of the situation were more pressing.
Not even when Mr. Lamont emerged from the Treasury to say that there was not a scintilla of doubt, this was his phrase, that we would remain within the ERM and that we would not devalue.
All I can say is what I said before. It did not carry conviction with me.
A British economic surrender has meant a financial windfall for the East. More aid from George Soros. But he's not immune from public controversy here. For all his dollars, George Soros hasn't received a universal welcome back in the East. In Romania, there are those who object to him for being a Hungarian. In Hungary, there's no disguising the fact that many dislike him for being a Jew. And in Slovakia, it's said he encounters prejudice on both those counts, for being a Hungarian and a Jew. It's in his country of origin where George Soros has faced the most criticism. He's spent £20 million in Hungary in the past 8 years. That's more than anywhere else. But the nationalist right wing is suspicious. A leading party newspaper objects to the way he's spending his money.
Soros appears to be supporting Hungary, the Ukraine, Romania, Poland and many other states. In all these countries he presents the same sort of program. In my opinion, it's a very vague sort of program. And in Hungary, this program of his is being promoted in a very one-sided way. So far it's involved supporting certain opposition parties, the parties that call themselves liberal.
There's a darker side to the opposition to Soros. In its attacks on him, Mr. Churka's newspaper has laid endless stress on his Jewishness. One 8-page article was headlined,
"Termites are devouring our nation. Reflections on the Soros regime and the Soros empire."
Among numerous references, it spoke of
the common role played by communists and Jews in the Hungarian power struggle. I didn't write that article. It was only published in my newspaper. There are no such expressions in it. I've had to face all these accusations because of another article I wrote. These accusations are untrue.
At another time in Eastern Europe, George Soros would have had every reason to fear the nationalists. Now he's an American and he confronts them.
These people are actually trying to establish a close society based on ethnic identity. So I'm really genuinely opposed to them. And I'm happy to have them as my enemies.
For the most part, George Soros has found friends in a democratic Eastern Europe. And not just among those who benefit directly. there's appreciation of his work from the new leadership. Václav Havel is currently a private citizen, but when Czechoslovakia splits, he's likely again to occupy high office. Mr. Soros's work has created some controversy from nationalist forces. What is your response to that?
I am completely and unreservedly on the side of Mr. Soros. I'm against those people who have any kind of doubts, reservations or suspicions, particularly when those doubts are linked to the nationalist cause.
For others in the East, George Soros's coup against sterling has only enhanced his prestige. Where before there was dark suspicion, now there is an eagerness to meet the man who broke the pound. Once there were doubts about the source of all his money, now things are perfectly plain. At a dinner party for the intellectual elite of Prague, conversation kept returning to the subject of all the money George Soros had made. Soros himself says that his new high profile may help in the East, even if it's a hindrance in the West. And he's happy to autograph British banknotes for charity. The latest attempt to get the British economy straight.
It is now appropriate to make a further reduction in interest rates. The Governor and I have agreed that the bank will tomorrow set the minimum lending rate at 7%.
On the day of the Chancellor's statement, Mr. Soros was in New York, not spending money, but making it again. He and his portfolio manager, Stanley Druckenmiller, were not over-impressed by the 1% cut.
Will this do the trick?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I'd like to see a little more aggression, but they're certainly, moving in the right direction. What do you think?
Well, I think 2% right away would have been the thing to do, but I think it will come anyhow.
If you just go in nickels and dimes, you don't get the full psychological effect. 3 or 4% inflation, 7% rates seem way too high to me. I think they have a long way to go.
So how does Mr. Soros rate the poor old pound today? Is he buying or selling?
I would still be selling sterling at this point. I think that the turning point will come when the German Bundesbank starts easing money, easing interest rates aggressively.
And when do you think that'll be?
I think it will be pretty soon, sooner than the markets think.
This week, Mr. Soros is still knocking European currencies around the court, even if the pressure on sterling has eased a bit. At 62, he is as sharp as ever at coining money, even if spending it gives him more of a gain. For the British, he has a further mischievous message. He's making very good use of our pounds.
That the West ought to have done and ought to do more for the East, so I'm happy to do it on their behalf, on behalf of every British citizen who really ought to have contributed £12.5 pounds to the transformation of Eastern Europe. I'm happy to deliver that.
When you're talking about £12 for every person in Britain, it shouldn't be for Mr. Soros to make the decision about how that money's spent. It should be for the British people themselves. And the unfortunate thing is that while Mr. Soros may claim that the uses that he's putting the money to are benevolent, there are plenty other people who could be making huge killings out of speculation and just using the money for themselves.
It's the American dream. In the final reel, the immigrant from Eastern Europe rides into the sunset near his country house on Long Island. In this story, though, he leaves behind the very British nightmare of a broken currency.